Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone who's here in person and joining us online then for this fourth session in the series of talks of exploring the world of Japanese studies. My name is Julia Dobson. I'm head of the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures here at the University of Manchester, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome everybody to the University of Manchester and to Manchester as well as, of course, a really intensive centre for the study of Japanese culture and for an increasing level of activity, cultural and otherwise, involving Japan. Many thanks to the Japan Foundation for their support for this event. I'm sure you will really enjoy a glimpse into the outstanding research of my colleagues here today who are going to talk to you shortly. Thank you.
My name is Chika Watanabe. I'm senior lecturer in social anthropology. I did my first PhD project on international aid, looking at one of the oldest Japanese NGOs that was affiliated with the Shinto-based religious movement. And I looked at their projects, their sustainable development and environmental projects in Japan, as well as in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. So I've always been interested in thinking of Japan as a global player, not only looking at Japan, but always seeing how Japan is connected to other countries. So for my PhD, I was interested in Japan's history and relationships in Asia itself, in the Southeast Asia region. But for my current project, or the project that's sort of ending right now, I've been looking at the relationships between Japan and Chile in Latin America, and their cooperation around disaster preparedness. And that's basically because I lived in Spain when I was little, so I speak Spanish, so I didn't have to learn any language. So I've been doing my research going back and forth between Japan and Spain. All right. Good stalling, everyone's sitting. All right. Okay. So today is the 11th of March. So today's the 11th of March. So it's an anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami that happened exactly 15 years ago. And I don't know how many of you were born that already, but I remember when it happened. And it was one of the biggest, disasters that struck Japan. It was magnitude 9.1, which was one of the greatest ever recorded, in Japan, but also in the world. And it was, I think the thing that really shocked people was the tsunami, because as I'll discuss, Japan prepares a lot for earthquakes. But tsunamis, people had not been preparing so much for tsunamis, and it took everyone by surprise. People talked a lot about, the height of the tsunami was so large that it went beyond people's expectations. So as you can see, there were, over 19,000 deaths, over 6,000 people injured, and over 2,000 people and possibly more went missing. And of course, as you probably remember or know from news stories, it affected the Fukushima nuclear power plants at the time, and there was radiation that spilled out, and continues to be a problem. But that was not the first time that Japan encountered a major disaster, right? One of the other reference points in Japan is the 1995 Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake. That was also a major earthquake that devastated the city of Kobe and surrounding areas. As you can see, there were a lot of deaths, over 100, 150,000 almost deaths, tens of thousands went missing. And there was a lot of fires that broke out. When an earthquake happens, it's not just the earth moving and buildings collapsing, but it's the things that happen because of it. The gas there could be gas explosions. In the case of Kobe, there was a lot of fires that erupted around the city. As you can see in the picture, it's, there was a a lot of the infrastructure broke down. So in the picture, you see a motorway that broke and there was a truck, you see a truck on the, that collapsed with it. And so one of the challenges was getting emergency services to reach survivors because, they also couldn't get through. But of course, the Hanshin Awaji earthquake was not the first big disaster either. You can see 1959, there was a major typhoon. And I point that out because that became the moment when the Japanese government ramped up its disaster preparedness. And, you have a law that comes into place for disaster management. But before that, in the 20th century, you have the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. Sorry, that's the one with 100,000, 150,000 deaths. And that was also, devastating, and it changed a lot of the landscape as well. So that's just even, just in the 20th century. So one of the things that came out of the 1995 Kobe earthquake, the Hanshin Awaji earthquake, is that because emergency services and government bodies couldn't reach survivors because the streets were all collapsed, they say that 80% of survivors were helped by family members or neighbors or people who were around them. So the role of citizens became really important after 1995. And so, it became sort of, governmental principles to include community-based disaster preparedness as one of the things that needed to be strengthened, as well as education. You have a lot of disaster education that happens in schools. But one of the challenges is that even though Japan is a country with a lot of disasters, many people, most people don't want to either remember that we had a major disaster because it can be traumatic, but also because disaster preparedness takes a lot of time, energy. I can talk about that a little bit. And also because, a major earthquake is supposed to happen very soon, but it might or might not happen within your lifetime or my lifetime. So then it's really hard to convince people to prepare for something that might or might not happen. They have other priorities, right? They have to, raise their children, find a job, tackle more immediate needs around them. So there is a challenge that even though there's major earthquakes and other disasters, that people don't really engage with a lot of the preparedness efforts at the community level. And this is not just in Japan, right? It happens all over the world. In Chile, it's the same, the country where I do research with lots of earthquakes, but also, in countries that have flooding as well. In this country, it's very hard to convince people to be prepared for floods as well. But so one of the things that I've been looking at is people that I call disaster preparedness educators. So they are city officials or grassroots community leaders who use fun and playful methods to teach disaster preparedness. Often to children, like you see in that picture, but also with adults and through children to their families and school communities as well. So I'm going to show, so one of the organizations that I've been working with very closely in this research is called Plus Arts. It's a social design nonprofit organization based in Kobe, also with an office in Tokyo. And I've been looking at one of the activities that they do that's called Izakairu Caravan. And it's a pun, but I don't need to explain it here. But anyway, it uses a frog as the main motif. But I'll show you, it should be just a short video, a promotional video from them, so you get a sense of what it is that they do. So as you saw, right, there's a lot of, it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be participatory, and it's with the children, but also the idea is that the parents or grandparents and family members, they'll be there to participate as well. And the idea is to make disaster preparedness less scary to think about and just more easy to incorporate in one's everyday lives, right? As you saw, a lot of the games are aimed to think about everyday relationships and also everyday objects as resources for survival. So in the blanket stretcher game, right, children, families, they're learning to turn a blanket and repurpose it as a stretcher, right? Or in the picture here, you see children using origami. So they might use newspapers or just pieces of paper you don't need anymore, and you make origami and turn it into a dish, for example, because in an earthquake, your dishes might be broken, right? So you need things to to eat with. So that's another way to think about the everyday as potentially being repurposed for the future. And also one of the things that I think, is important to emphasize is that a lot of these games are for fun, but also they are aimed to encourage people to cooperate with each other and to help each other, right? So it's that building of, what sociologists call weak ties that are really important in these games. So it's not just your close family members, your close friends, but it's about establishing some kind of, even if it's a light touch sort of relationship with your neighbors or just someone who, your coworkers or whoever happens to be in the game with you from the neighborhood. And so it's about establishing those relationships. It's sort of like training those relationships so that if an emergency happens, you can, mobilize those, mutual help systems. And yeah, so all of these playful methods have spread to other countries. People from all over the world come to Japan to learn about disaster preparedness. And often these playful methods are what really inspires them and they take it back to their country. So one of the places that I've looked at is Chile. As you can see, in the map, both countries are part of what's called the Ring of Fire, which is, where the tectonic plates are extremely active. So Chile, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, also has a lot of earthquakes and tsunamis, in addition to other climate change related disasters. And one of the things that I'm interested in, through these playful methods is that it uses a form of logic that's not about, sort of a militaristic form of protection, but it's about telling people that, look, when a big earthquake happens, you might still die, your cities might still collapse, but we can, help you to survive, we can up the chances of survival a little bit. And I call this, this logic of fragility, of recognizing that life is fragile, things can fall apart tomorrow, but we can still do something, right? It doesn't say we will save you, but it says, we can help you survive a little bit better.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to follow up on something that Chika was talking about. That was about relationship and networks. So I'm Erika Baffelli. I work mainly on religion in contemporary Japan. But what I'm going to look at now in my short presentation is mainly about what happened after a disaster in terms of networks and relationships. So some of this network that I've been trying to trace between Tohoku and different other parts of Japan, and in particular with the neighborhood in Tokyo. And there's been a lot of study on religious mobilization after the 3/11 disaster, and what has been the different kind of help and activity they've been doing in the area. But what I was more interested in was to try to trace down some of this network and also to look at other emergencies that happened afterwards. So Chika was talking about the one that happened before, but even after we had, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then several other earthquakes that happened in Japan. So I've been trying to look at what's happened afterwards. And in particular, I was looking at the relationship between the Tohoku, this area in Northeast Japan, where the tribal disaster happened, and the temple in a neighborhood in Tokyo that is called, so I was looking at this small temple, and the Pure Land Temple, and this is, you can see, it's quite small one, in an area that is called Sanya in Tokyo, which was a well-known area for being where the day labor market was. So the day labor used to live there in very simple accommodation. They were called doya, and especially in the 1990s. And nowadays, is more characterized of an aging population, and also is one of the area in Tokyo where you have, in Sanya, in the neighbors area, a lot of people living on the streets, the road sleeper and homeless. So what I was interested in was well, the first relationship between actually Sanya and Tohoku is that a lot of these former slavers or daily laborers in Sanya came from Tohoku. There is a train line, the Jobel line from Tohoku to Tokyo, and a lot of them actually are from that area. And if you like novels, one of the novels that talk about this, one of these workers is Tokyo Ueno Station. There's now also in English by Yumiri that describe one of these men that lived in the area. So what I was looking at, it was this Buddhist association founded in 2009 that is called Hitosaji no Kai, One Spoonful Association, that is a volunteer-based organization. The founder were all Buddhist priests, but the volunteer are not necessarily affiliated to Buddhism or to any temple, as a very variety of volunteers. I will talk a little bit more later as well. And one of their main activity is to distribute food for people living in the streets in the area. But also they also participated in several other networks that I was quite interested in exploring. So one of the activities that they been working on it with the communities was to create graves that were accessible to everybody, and was mainly for people that don't have their ancestral grave, they don't have a family grave, which include often the people living on the street, but even the migrants or other people that don't want or cannot be in their ancestral graves. So they created several graves in this small cemetery. There are for everybody, and in particular, this columbarium that was opened a few years ago that has, in 2015, has a statue of Kannon, the Bodhisattva of mercy, and Buddhism with a rosary to symbolize the multi-faith, and that everybody can go into this grave. And this is another connection with Tohoku, because the artist who made this statue was someone that the priest met during disaster relief activities in Tohoku in 2011 and 12, and then asked this person to create this spatial statue for this grave. The other connection that I was interested in, so this is a more with closer images of the statue. You can see the rosary on it. When I was visiting and I was doing work as a volunteer there, I started to notice a lot of bags of rice, and we were preparing bags of rices to be distributed to food pantries in the area. And a lot of those rice come from the Tohoku area. So I was reading the label, and then I wanted to know why this was happening. And then there was explained to me that there was this circulation, there was this bond that was created during the disaster relief activity had continued afterwards, and now farmer of Tohoku was sending rice to Sanya to be distributed in the neighborhood. This was also part of a larger rice redistributors in Japan amongst temples that were several temples sending the supply of rice they couldn't use to Tokyo, and then it was redistributed to low-income family or people that needed it. So one of the concepts that I was quite interested about was, we often heard the concept of charity in the Christian context, but in the Buddhist context, what they use is the concept of shien, which shien means support in Japanese, but they usually write it with the second character, is with the kanji, with the character of karmic bond. So it's a connection that is also a connection of reciprocity rather than charity. So it's a connection about this idea that I might need something today, and you may need something in the future. So it's a connection that goes from the past to present and the future, and it's related to what Chika was talking about creating this network. Then when a crisis happens, you can mobilize, even if they are a smaller network, but they can immediately act. And one example, very clear example of that happened during the pandemic. Some of the volunteers that was working with this association were Vietnamese migrants living in Japan, other students or workers, and a lot of them were stranded in Japan. There were no flights back to Vietnam. They were losing their job. Their visa was expiring. So some of them find themselves in a very difficult situation. So not only they couldn't be volunteer anymore, but they became in need of help. So this temple in north of Tokyo, in Saitama, became a shelter. The Vietnamese Buddhist temple, run by the Buddhist nun, it became a shelter for this Vietnamese worker that were stranded in Japan. And again, another circulation of rice, a collection of rice among all these temples restarted that was called the Emergency Rice Donation Support Project for Vietnamese people in Japan. And you could follow, I was following on social media at the time. I couldn't go to Japan, but they were posting regularly all this collection of rice that was arriving for the Vietnamese community and then redistributed. And they collected around 15 tons of rice by the end of 2020 to be redistributed. And what it was also interesting when I visited this temple, the one in Saitama, the people there were then preparing pack of masks that were then sent back to Tokyo to be redistributed to people on the street. So it was again this idea of reciprocity. So of course, the time of crisis, there is a disruption, a rupture with what happened before and what will happen after. There is the idea of perpetual suspension, especially for people that are stuck in a place. But there is also this idea that there is an impulse towards something, a redirection, a renewal. There's something new can happen. And one of these processes, the process that I was thinking about of remembering, of recreating a connection, and remembering people into the community. That can be by remembering them in death, with a memorial ritual, or reconnected with them through this kind of reciprocity. And two very final example, again, in connection with Tohoku, there is an ongoing project of building a big Buddhist statue in Miyagi Prefecture. And the idea is that this statue is not necessarily only for the victim of 3/11, but it's also for everybody who has suffered loss. And what the explanation is, the pain of loss is not only common to bereaved family for the earthquake, but also to those who have lost people they love through disaster, poverty, war, discrimination, violence, illness, accident, incident. So it's again a much more collective idea of the loss. And and then very final, if you know, there was a big earthquake in the Noto Peninsula in 2024, and some of the people involved in this organization went to the Noto Peninsula when it was possible to do some relief activity, to meet the people in the community there, and especially to organize some activity with children. And what they brought was package of sweets that's been prepared by the Vietnamese community living in Tokyo. Again, expanded this kind of connection of bond, of CN.
My name is Yuki Asahina. I'm a lecturer in Japanese studies, and I don't necessarily talk directly about Tohoku today, but I guess my presentation is somewhat similar to Erika's in the sense that I look at how people respond to social changes in Japan, and especially people at the margins of the Japanese society. And what I initially had today was that today's audience will be sixth formers. This room looks much older than the sixth formers, but I don't know, like the British teenagers might be like, looking older than Japanese ones. But anyway, so there's one problem about today's world, which is that there are not nearly enough good jobs for the number of qualified candidates entering the labor market, which is a common challenge across the globe, and in the UK and Japan. So to understand this situation in Japan, I want to start with what I think is the most important chart about contemporary Japanese society. Now, other professors might say something different, but this is my opinion. So this chart shows the proportion of, or the share of so-called non-regular workers within the Japanese, old workers. Now, in Japan, the employment is often divided into two categories. One is so-called regular employment, or regular workers who have stable long-term employment with relatively high wages and benefits. By contrast, non-regular workers who typically have temporary, part-time or contract-based jobs with significantly less job security. So what happened in Japan over the last 4 decades is that the share of so-called non-regular workers has increased from about 15% in 1984 to nearly 40% of all workforce in recent years. And if you think of this, this is a profound change. And it begs, it raises so many important questions. In this kind of situation, what happens when people constantly have to worry about losing their jobs? How does this affect their ability to, build stable lives? Or what does it mean for class inequality, etc., etc.? And to some extent, this is a problem for me, but it is a bigger problem for your generation. I mean, suppose you're 6 years old. Okay. So, and quite importantly, this became a wide public concern in Japan in the 2010s, around this period in which the increase of the share of non-regular employment reached its peak. And for that reason, these social changes are also reflected in Japanese literature, as Erika also talked about. If you go to large bookstores in the UK today, like Blackwell, you see a lot of Japanese novels being translated. And many of these novels that are popular now in the UK were written in the context of the 2010s Japan, in which the work has become insecure in a very rapid pace. So, for example, this one, Sayaka Murata's novel, Convenience Store Woman, portrays the life of a woman in so-called the Ice Age generation who entered the labor market at the worst period and reflects the experience of people stuck in precarious employment. Or older works, more or less, of Mieko Kawakami, talks about the issues of gender inequality and poverty, which is embedded in this broader context of labor market insecurity. So these novels, in one way or another, discusses the answers or implications of the questions that emerged in the context of labor market insecurity. And I try to address these questions in a different way from these novelists. So toward the end of the 2010s, I spent a lot of time in Tokyo, as well as in Seoul, because I also study about South Korea, spending time with labor union activists and young workers to look at how they deal with this kind of situation. And now hanging out with these labor union activists basically means two things. One is to yell at the employers, and the other is to drink beer. But I mean, I didn't drink most of them. And Japanese people are often considered to be non-political or apolitical. And I think that's true for the most part. But what I found in this study is that many young people are engaged in creative forms of activism and resistance to labor market flexibilization. And now let me give you one example that I observed. So this photo shows the workers from what I call the company JP Drinks. this company employs about 5,000 people across the nation, and their job is to drive trucks and refill these vending machines that you can see everywhere in Japan. But the working condition in this company was horrible. Many workers arrive at the workplace around 7, and they work typically until 9 or 9:30 p.m. And most of the unpaid overtime work was, most of the overtime work was unpaid. And there are also other instances of physical and psychological abuses, so much so that one manager in this workplace was called the kickman because he kicks employees all the time. So eventually, they became tired of this kind of situation and they decided to take action. So what they did was very interesting, which is called a work-to-rule strike. So the idea here is very simple. In a work-to-rule strike, workers simply follow their contract and not do more than that. So this supposed to this is the way it should be in the first place. But before this, they have been doing overtime work for more than 100 hours a month for not being paid. And what's interesting happened, which was that so they did this at Tokyo Station, which is one of the busiest train stations in the world. And when they did the work-to-rule strike at the Tokyo Station, the vending machines at the station started running out of drinks. And it became something like this. And so this was interesting in a Japanese context, probably not in the UK, because in Japan, vending machines also almost never run out of drinks. But I'm not sure about the UK. So this attracted a lot of public attention, and workers or labor union activists started posting these photos to social media, to their social media accounts. And for example, this photo got retweeted more than 50,000 times within a few hours after they uploaded it. And soon, over 10,000 people signed an online petition supporting the workers. Then the story was picked up by virtually all the major news outlets in Japan. So at the time, this was one small example of many other instances of labor activism happening in that country. And since then, I started working on something else. In the last several years, I was doing something else. And to be honest, I didn't pay much attention to this topic. But more recently, I returned to this topic because I have to write a few articles about this. And to my surprise, I learned that because of the, this and other types of small activism, there was a significant change in the Japanese, the situation of non-regular workers in Japan for good. So partly because of the increased public attentions and media coverage of the ills of so-called non-regular employment, the government had to introduce several new labor policies to ameliorate the conditions of non-regular employment. So as a result, for example, the average wages for non-regular workers, sorry, I have to wrap up. Average wages for non-regular workers increased by about 20% in the last 10 years, whereas the average wages for regular workers, for more secure workers, increased by only about 9% in the same period. So this development represents somewhat unexpected and underappreciated instance of labor victory, which I'm not sure we can see in other countries. But then again, I'll skip this. This is the second most important chapter about contemporary Japan. But then again, there are other challenges. Japan is aging extremely rapidly. In 2002, the average age of these non-regular workers was 42. In 2022, it was 49. And at this point, I think it's over 50. So what these changes mean for Japan or for the world, broadly speaking, is unclear at this point, and that's something I might need to explore. But to wrap up, part of Japan's story is a hopeful one. Despite the growing insecurity in the labor market, workers, activists, and public pressure achieved some tangible outcomes, for good. In many ways, Japan is at the forefront of challenges that other societies are facing or will face in a very short period of time. So for that reason, I believe Japan has something to offer and for the world and for you to listen to. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening and being patient. So I'm the last one. And I thought before I talk about my research, I'm going to talk a little bit about myself because nobody knows actually what I'm doing, including my family. So a little bit about myself. So I'm actually specialized in the history of science and medicine in modern and post-war Japan, which is roughly between 1860s and 1960s. And so I'm the history person for Japanese studies at Manchester, and I'm going to talk about history today. And I do look at politics of reproduction and population. Most recently, I'm working on the history of what's called eugenic surgeries, and this is the main topic of my talk today. So my part of, and this has something to do with memorializing the 3/11 disaster. Actually, my story actually starts with this. Now, so this was a clip from the breaking news, as you can see, aired, and this was aired on the 3rd of July in 2024 by TBS, which is one of the major news corporations. And this was about reporting how the Supreme Court in Japan, of course, the highest judicial organization, ruled that eugenic surgeries, which were conducted under the law I'm going to talk about, were unconstitutional. And specifically unconstitutional, which means violating some of the articles which are stated in the Constitution of Japan, and particularly in Article 13, which says all of the people shall be respected as individuals. And the other one is Article 14, which says all of the people are equal under the law, and there shall be no discrimination. Right, and then it goes on. So in Japan, this eugenic surgery was performed on people for most of the latter half of the 20th century. And under this law called eugenic protection law. As you can see, this was in effect in 1948 and 96. Now, before I talk about eugenic surgeries, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is eugenics, right? So basically, I guess maybe some of the sixth formers who have taken history courses or some of the maybe even medicine might have heard about this word. But basically, it was a belief, or sometimes in the past, it was thought to be a scientific field, that humans could be improved by controlling who was allowed to have children and who was not, right? And many doctors, scientists, population experts, health activists, journalists, and social critics in the past, they were, they in fact talked about, said that certain traits, for instance, intelligence, were better. So those with intelligence should be allowed to have more children, and certain traits, for instance, disabilities, those with disabilities, so disabilities were bad, therefore they shouldn't be allowed to have children. And in the case of, and of course, this led to governments, including Britain, in fact, to support some unfair or harmful policies. And in the case of Nazi Germany, this went extreme and allowing the state or, doctors who were employed by the state to perform so-called eugenic surgeries or surgeries to make people infertile. It's called sterilization. And this happened in Japan as well under this law. Right? And if you think about it, I mean, for sixth formers or those who are slightly younger or older, looks like an old, but in fact, it's not old. If you look into history, it in fact happened, and I mean, this law was in fact in place until 1996. Many of you must have been already born, or maybe not. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the law itself. So the law, I wrote the law's aim. I quote here for those of you who are learning Japanese. So this was issued on the 13th of July, and it was in fact revised the wartime national eugenic law. Yes, it did exist, this kind of eugenic law. It did exist in Japan as well. And this was modeled on Nazi Germany's sterilization law. And the aim here, I quote and translate from the Japanese here, to prevent the birth of defective offspring from a eugenic perspective and to protect maternal life and health. And it did then, kind of authorize or permitted abortion, birth control, or contraception and eugenic surgery under this law. And it was in effect until 1996. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight is this definition, eugenic surgery, which was in the definition given in the law, refers to surgery prescribed by order that renders a person unable to reproduce without removing the gonads. Gonads are reproductive organs, right? Like uterus. However, in fact, removing uterus was quite often done under this, right? And it was widely practiced. And this was the reported cases of eugenic sterilization, all cases, including maternal, for the purpose of maternal protection of maternal health. Now, so I said at the beginning, this has things to do with Tohoku. No, so this, in fact, litigation. So obviously Supreme Court ruled something, right? And this was a lawsuit, right? A series of lawsuits made since 2018 by the survivors or their guardians or families. And the first one was made by a woman who was actually in the area where the disaster happened, right? Now, what happened is quite remarkable, in fact, afterwards. So after the Supreme Court's decision, what happened? So another remarkable thing that the Supreme Court did was to say, look, you have to compensate. Not only that these are, this practice was unconstitutional, but you need to compensate. So the law, and then that led to state apology, which was quite significant. And the compensation law then was quite another really remarkable thing, which is for us historians is quite exciting, is that the compensation law, which was issued in fact last year, included this chapter and article. As you can see, I'm not going to read out loud. It says that it basically says that the state should conduct investigations, right? So basically look into the past, right? Learn from the past so we don't actually repeat the same mistakes. That's amazing, So for historians, this is a victory, right? The only problem, however, is that for historians to do our job, for our work research, we need sources, right? We need historical sources. We study sources, right? Now, the sources that are available to us so far are like this. So this is actually problematic because the sources that are given to us by the state or by local authorities, in fact, is what's called redacted, right? So the information is basically just, blacked out, basically, with the markers. So what do you do as a historian, right? We're stuck, right? We won't know nothing, we won't know what happened actually. So in order to actually, overcome this challenge, a lot of things are happening in Japan today. One of them is, in fact, a lawsuit, another lawsuit. Now, this one, this is a report by the Kyoto Shimbun. So this is a local newspaper based in Kyoto. And the Kyoto newspaper, in fact, a journalist there who is very interested in this topic, made a lawsuit and say to certain prefectures, so it's like counties in this country, demanded that they should disclose information, get rid of these like black markers. And in fact, this one is reporting, it literally came out really recently, about a month ago, as you can see here on the date, reporting that in fact, a lot of the lawsuit, was actually successful. And here it shows, and this is the same newspaper articles, it says, so this maps kind of which prefectures have or have not disclosed information, right? And those, so blue prefectures marked in orange, in fact, have agreed to disclose the data. And then blue, it says have not yet disclosed, but consider disclosing. And then gray is they not disclose. Now, okay, so it's kind of like still half and half, but we have just started, this process has started. So we're really hopeful. Another way we're tackling, well, I said we, is, in the academia, in this, in a university setup, research projects are running. And here is the title. And so this one is based, these research projects are based in Ritsumeikan University. It's a private university in Kyoto, and which I'm actually involved. So I do actually go to Kyoto quite often. And what we do is basically creating archives related to the protection law. Now, how do you do that? How do you create archives? One way of doing is to conduct interviews. So what we historians call oral history interviews. So we approach survivors, right? And we actually ask what happened and what they feel, what they feel at the time. It's a really hard work, actually. But our colleagues in Japan are doing a great job and are compiling quite a lot of archival data now. So what's another interesting thing is, through this oral history interviews, network is created as well. So, going back to Chika and Erica's. So this is not only about research, but also creating communities, right? Communities of people, researchers, activists, also survivors who are working together to, kind of address this past issue and move on to, how to think about how to move on and, to the future. So what we call redressing activities, right? So to conclude, so obviously, Japan's eugenic surgery history caused quite a lot of suffering. So efforts to redress this past, however, are underway. Now, major challenges do persist, especially with inaccessible redacted data, And then there are also initiatives that address these challenges, and which are involved. And universities do play a key role in redress work, and Japanese studies in this way, offers insights for global redress efforts. In fact, we are in conversation with colleagues across the world through this work. So that's it from me. So thank you.
Were any foreigners in Japan subject to eugenics?
That's a very good question. We haven't found any evidence so far that actually prove that foreigners were sterilized. However, what counts as foreigners, right, is different. And we talked about how in the class as well, how Ainu people, for instance, were forced to have Japanese names. So names alone don't really actually, but they are also Japanese people, but they were also kind of marginalized, right? We don't, again, Chinese, Korean names, they also had, oftentimes they had, had social lives with their Japanese names. So it's really difficult. So in fact, this issues of, ethnicity, race, ethnicity, nationality, in the implementation of the law is something we need to still find out. So it's complex.
Well, I mean, as a social anthropologist, anyone studying social anthropology, because we're a very small discipline. So if anybody's interested in anthropology, learning cultures, what it means to belong in a society or a community, what it means to be a family, what that means in different contexts, that's the kind of stuff that anthropology would do. I mean, for me, obviously disasters are getting worse and worse. So for me, that's a very important topic for the future. And another thing that I'm interested in that sort of relates to Aya's research is depopulation and aging, which, Yuki also mentioned as well. So that is also another topic that I think is worth looking into in the future.
For the religion aspect, I think the recent events showed that we need people that know about politics and religion and law in Japan, what was going on at the moment with Unification Church and after the assassination of Abe. I think there is still a lot of study that could be done in ethnographic studies of the interaction between small religion organization and group and the society. Or this environmental issue, gender issues. There is still quite a lot to explore in terms, especially of ethnography to be done. I think and there will be coming quite interesting topic to explore in the discussion. Also, of course, the decline of religion, of secularization, etc.
So I guess it kind of overlaps with what has already been said, but I'm a sociologist, and I had this conversation with another sociologist in Japan recently, and sociology has emerged in Europe at the aftermath of this massive social changes, such as the French Revolution. And there's a lot of uncertainty in society, and there's a lot of questions about how people deal with the new types of uncertainty and instability, etc., etc. So that was the origin. But because, besides the war that's happening in Iran and Ukraine, we don't see that level of social changes in recent years. And for that reason, sociology itself is getting closer to something like demographic science in recent years, according to that person's opinion. And as we discussed briefly in my last slide, I guess one of the most profound changes that's taking place in today's world is the changes in population structure. And Japan, again, is at the forefront of this change. So I think that this is a fruitful area to study.
For historians, I mean, you are tricky because you're a historian as well and specialize in Japan. So I think we do actually share quite a lot of interest. But I think for historians, what's really interesting is where, for Japan studies, I mean, it's been going on, but where does this Japan come from, right? And Japan, as we know today, its territories, its people, and understanding identity have changed massively. And how does that, but we still need to know, right? Where does that contours of Japan, what we call it, contours of Japan actually come from, and what kind of stories have been, or histories have been, in fact, kind of what's called elided or hidden, or purposefully hidden for a certain narrative of Japan, right? We think that Japan is only lived by Japanese people. That's not true, right? It's a mono-ethnic nation. That's not true, right? To unpack that more, and a lot of migrations were going on. But personally, I'm also interested in this Asian population thing, right? How did this demographic changes, in fact, happened and were allowed to happen, right? To the extent that Japan is the most aging society in the world. And it's really rapidly going,
But I think that one other aspect interesting on that is slightly neglected is then the study of the youth. Because there is so much attention on the study of the aging population and elderly care, but what about the young people? And I think there's going to be more that need to be done, and also in terms of what I was talking about migration. I know in terms of also religious communities, some of religion are becoming larger as communities in Japan, and that will be another area that still need a lot of work. And you need people that speak several languages as well. So you can see more kind of team, group-based research, working with different disciplines, but also people working with in different languages.
In fact, In fact, it is becoming common that for scholars of Japanese, it's not enough to only know Japanese. So that you are almost like encouraged to be multilingual, right.
Yeah, it had a major impact. I think one, because I think until that point, Japanese society, the government was quite proud and confident that they had a very well-prepared country. And then they saw what happened with the earthquake and they realized they were not as prepared as they thought. So I think that was one. Two, it also, I mean, as I mentioned, it really emphasized the importance of community-based preparedness because of the limits of the state. When a major earthquake happens, the state emergency services will not be able to come. So we need people, citizens, to be prepared. And another is that 1995 is also set to be the foundation year of volunteering. So Japanese people didn't really volunteer until that point, but a lot of people from around the country rushed to Kobe to help survivors. And so it's set to be the rise of, volunteering in Japan. So a lot of laws also came into effect to formalize nonprofit organizations and volunteer work as well. So yeah, a lot of actually changes came. And a lot of societies, this happens in a lot of societies, a major earthquake or disaster will, historians will know better, but Chile as well, a lot of the country's legal systems, government systems were shaped by major earthquakes.
For religion, is also there's been quite a lot written about that in the 1995 earthquake, there was a criticism of religion not doing enough. And if a lot of the activity was not really portrayed in the media. So what's happening in 2011 was this importance for religion organization to be quite visible in their relief activities. But the other thing is in 1995, earthquake was also followed in March by the sarin gas attack in Tokyo subway that was perpetrated by a member of religion organization. So you also had this other big impact on the image of religion in Japan in 1995 that impacted the response of religion organization in 2011. So definitely an important relationship between the two.
Okay, I guess from sociology's point of view, it's like somewhat similar to what Chika-san has already said, but I guess there are two things that one is this Hanshin earthquake in 1995 kind of exposed the hidden strengths of the Japanese civil society, because the conventional understanding of the Japanese civil society is that it's very weak and decentralized after the, like, largely what is largely considered as the failure of the student activism in the 1960s and 1970s. There wasn't much social movement activities or like civic activism going on in the country. But then there was this earthquake, and scholars and people more broadly started realizing that actually, there's this hidden capability of civil society and their actors in Japan. And another consequence of this is that I think some people would argue that these hidden strengths of the civil society organization and the rise of volunteerism in Japan somewhat unexpectedly promoted the neoliberalization of social services, because the idea here is that from the status perspective, now you guys can do these things without us, so we don't need to pay money. So, but I should try not to be too pessimistic.
I'll pass.
I don't study the 2011 earthquake, so I'm not sure. But I do know that because in 1995 in Kobe, they did not take that consideration. So a lot of communities were split up, and that caused a lot of what's called lonely deaths. People who died alone in reconstruction, apartment built blocks as well, so they didn't have neighborly relations. So they learned from that. So I know that in 2011, they did try to keep communities together. But whether or not that has been really successful or not, I can't really comment. Probably better than 95, but not ideal.
Yeah, it might depend on the specific area. The only area I visited more recently is the Fukushima area. Yumiri, the author, I thought she set up a theater there for high school. So I went to visit this cafe. It's a book cafe and a theater for the community. And apparently in that area, there is a bit difference in different villages, depending how many people came back, because quite a lot left. And there are some villages where more people that came back. So the community has restarted. But in some, very few people came back to live there again. And so you have very few houses with lights in there, even in a lot of houses where nobody lives in there. So this kind of community. And I had the opportunity there to meet. We had a talk in the afternoon, and quite a lot of people from the community came, and we discussed exactly that. And a lot of them were people that lived in Tokyo for many years, and they just moved back to that area. But I think that's depends probably on the.
I guess one context is that region that was struck in 2011, Tohoku, they were already depopulating and aging because they're rural areas. Not many job opportunities for young people. So they were already struggling they were thinning as communities. And so, so I think it's hard. Yeah, so the disaster could have made that worse. But what I have also seen, because I worked for a humanitarian organization when 2011 struck. I mean, I did it before I did my PhD, so I just went back to them to help. And so I went to Shinomaki for a bit. And what I saw was that a lot of the young people who were planning to leave, even before the earthquake, they saw these volunteers from other parts of the world or other parts of the country come. And then they started thinking, oh, maybe there's something in our community that can, we can offer that can be, strengthened. And so a couple of them that I see on Facebook, and I knew back then they were going to do it, but, they started a nonprofit organization or a community revitalization project. So yeah, I mean, that was also a dynamic. Yeah.
Well, we don't know. I mean, apart from the fact that there's a strong belief that women are in charge of reproductive matters, right? Even though the surgery, either this sterilization surgery would have been medically easier if it was performed on men than women. And this persisted for a long time. This kind of, I guess, gender norm and gender discrimination, and maybe that's a strong factor.
So as I was introduced, I am the program director of the Japanese Studies undergraduate programs. And I have a PowerPoint, but I have too many slides to cover in 5 minutes. So I'm just going to tell you some basic features of the program. So first of all, we have many programs. Yes, we have single honors Japanese, where you can study Japanese and almost nothing else, and a few other things if you really want to. And we also have joint honors programs, where you can study Japanese studies and something else, like another language, or linguistics, or sociology, or politics, or business, for example. Okay? The examples are almost endless. How can you contain your excitement? But all of our Japanese studies programs have 2 key components. One being intensive study of the Japanese language. Intensive. So that means starting in the first year at 8 or 9 hours of classroom time every week. Okay? Hardcore. You need to work hard. And taking you to advanced fluency in both written and spoken Japanese by the end of your degree, assuming that is that you work hard. Okay? So that's one key component. And the other key component, of course, is to study about Japan. So about Japan's history and culture and society, because as you have just seen, we have all these wonderful people who will enlighten you on this subject, okay? So it is a 4-year program, and year 3 is spent wholly or partly in Japan, okay? So you will be immersing yourself in Japanese life, most likely at one of our partner universities. Currently, we have 24 partner universities in Japan, all the way from snowy Hokkaido in the north down to balmy Kyushu in the south. Most of our partner universities are in the Tokyo area, which attracts so many people because, as we know, Tokyo is such a vibrant metropolis. But we also have quite a few partners in the Kansai area, where you can enjoy the distinctive culture of Osaka or the traditions of Kyoto and so on and so forth. And we have some partners in other parts of Japan as well. So looking at my watch, oh yes, it's pretty well 7:30. I need to wrap up. So we have lots of exciting programs. We have lots of graduates who seem to be very happy when they end, not just because they're ending, but because they've had such a great time. And so I encourage those of you who are young enough, or well, we actually have one undergraduate now who is older than I am. So any age you can study our programs. But whatever age you are, you might want to consider our programs for your future.